The rain had passed over St. Mildred's that morning, leaving the air heavy with the scent of damp roses. In the neat cottages that framed the village green, curtains fluttered and gossip brewed with the same vigor as the morning tea. Mrs. Emily Carruthers, who fancied herself the social pillar of St. Mildred's, had decided to host her annual afternoon tea, a tradition that was, as everyone said, simply unmissable. Lace tablecloths, sponge cakes, and the promise of scandal made it the event of the week. Miss Jane Marple, quiet and observant as ever, had received her invitation with a polite nod and a faint smile. She rarely declined such occasions. Human nature, she often said, revealed itself best over tea and small talk. And the Carruthers' tea was known for both in equal measure. By 3 o'clock, the guests had gathered beneath the striped garden awning. China cups clinked delicately as polite laughter drifted over the hedges. Mrs. Wilmot, the vicar's wife, was recounting a rather exaggerated story about her husband's sermon, while Colonel Farnsworth grumbled about the rising price of petrol. Near the tea table, young Lily Marsh, the Carruthers' maid, poured tea with trembling hands, her eyes darting nervously toward her employer. Miss Marple noticed that tremor. She noticed, too, how Mrs. Carruthers spoke sharply to the girl whenever she lingered too near the guests. Poor thing, Miss Marple thought, watching Lily's downcast eyes. Servants often know more than their mistresses would like to believe. At 3:30, the bell of St. Mildred's Church tolled softly across the green. Mrs. Carruthers raised her teacup for a toast. "To friendship and good manners," she declared, her pearls glinting in the pale sunlight. The guests responded cheerfully, though Miss Marple caught the briefest of frowns pass between Colonel Farnsworth and Mrs. Wilmot. There was a story there. There always was. And then it happened. A scream, sharp, unmistakable, split the pleasant hum of conversation. Teacups rattled. A chair fell. Lily Marsh stood frozen by the terrace, her tray slipping from her fingers. Mrs. Carruthers had collapsed forward, face buried in her scone plate, her pearls tangled in the teacup chain. For a long, dreadful moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint trickle of tea spilling over the edge of the tablecloth. "She's fainted," someone cried. But Miss Marple was already on her feet, her calm eyes fixed on the fallen woman. She noted the slight purpling at the lips, the stiffening of the fingers, and the small, overturned sugar bowl by Mrs. Carruthers' hand. "Not fainted," Miss Marple murmured quietly. "I'm afraid, dear, that Mrs. Carruthers has taken her tea rather permanently." The garden fell into horrified silence. Rain threatened again, gathering in dark clouds above the chimneys. And as the guests huddled in confusion and whispers, Miss Marple glanced once more at Lily, pale, trembling, and clutching her apron, before looking down at the sugar bowl. Something told her the sweetness had turned deadly. The rain began again, softly at first, drumming against the awning in a rhythm that matched the growing unease of the guests. The laughter that had once filled the Carruthers' garden now dissolved into frantic whispers and pale, darting glances. Colonel Farnsworth stood rigid, his face drained of color, while Mrs. Wilmot fanned herself uselessly with a napkin. Lily Marsh, still clutching the hem of her apron, backed toward the kitchen door as if she might disappear through it altogether. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained perfectly composed. She bent slightly over Mrs. Carruthers' body, her sharp eyes taking in every detail: the spilled sugar, the faint whiff of bitter almonds, the small teaspoon that lay just beyond the saucer. She did not touch anything. She merely looked, her expression one of quiet sorrow rather than shock. The signs, she knew, were unmistakable. When Inspector Graves arrived 20 minutes later, his boots leaving wet prints across the flagstone path, the guests were gathered miserably in the drawing-room. He was a thick-set man with a cautious manner and the air of one who disliked being summoned to polite gatherings. "I understand there's been an unfortunate incident," he began, tugging off his hat and glancing toward Miss Marple, who stood near the window with her knitting bag in hand. "Unfortunate indeed," she said gently. "Mrs. Carruthers has passed away quite suddenly during tea. I fear it was not of natural causes." The inspector frowned. "You're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "But I dare say the sugar bowl may hold more than sugar." Graves blinked, then motioned for the constable to seal the area. The guests watched in uneasy silence as the constable, trying not to tremble, covered the table with a cloth. Lily Marsh was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple had noticed her slip out moments before, when the first commotion began. By the time the body had been carried inside, evening shadows had stretched across the room. Graves began his questioning, moving from one guest to another, his pencil scratching briskly in his notebook. "When did you last see Mrs. Carruthers alive? Who poured the tea? Did anyone touch the sugar bowl?" The answers were confused and defensive. Mrs. Wilmot insisted she hadn't sweetened her tea at all. Colonel Farnsworth muttered that he preferred his plain. The young curate, Mr. Bellamy, looked as though he might faint himself. No one, it seemed, had noticed anything, except Miss Marple. She stood near the fireplace, watching each answer, each flicker of hesitation. She noted how Mrs. Wilmot's hands twisted in her lap when Colonel Farnsworth's name was mentioned, how the curate's eyes darted toward the doorway whenever Lily's absence was mentioned. Everyone had a shadow hanging behind their politeness. "Inspector," Miss Marple said at last, when Graves had finished scribbling, "if I might make a small observation, the sugar bowl had been refilled only this morning, I believe." Graves looked puzzled. "Possibly. Why?" "Because I recall Mrs. Carruthers complaining last week that her maid, poor Lily, had mistaken salt for sugar in the pantry. She was quite cross about it. I imagine she made Lily handle the matter herself today as a test of her competence." The inspector raised his brows. "You think the girl might have tampered with it?" Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "Oh, I think Lily was frightened enough today, but not of the police. Fear can take many forms, Inspector, especially in houses where tempers are short and secrets grow like ivy." She let her gaze drift to the rain-smeared window, where faint reflections of the villagers pressed against the glass outside, eager for a glimpse of tragedy. Somewhere in the back garden, a teacup still lay shattered on the grass, the last fragile sound of a woman's final afternoon. Miss Marple turned back to the inspector. "If I may suggest," she said, "you might start not with the sugar, but with who had reason to make Mrs. Carruthers drink it." And with that, she folded her hands calmly, as though the mystery had already begun to unravel in her mind. The night deepened around St. Mildred's, pressing softly against the windows of the Carruthers' house. Inside, the lamps glowed low, casting long, uneasy shadows across the parlor. The guests had been dismissed one by one, leaving only Inspector Graves, his constable, and Miss Marple seated quietly by the hearth. The air still carried a faint scent of almonds, ghostly now, yet impossible to ignore. Graves rubbed his temple, notebook open, the pencil smudging his thumb. "I'll have to question the maid first thing in the morning," he muttered. "She's gone home, you say?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes half closed, as though she were listening to something beyond the inspector's words. "Mrs. Carruthers was a strict woman," she said softly. "Lily would not have left unless someone told her she might. Fear doesn't always make one run. Sometimes it makes one obey." Graves glanced up sharply. "You think someone dismissed her?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, setting her knitting aside, "that she was made to feel in the way. Servants are often the first to see what should not be seen, and the first to be sent away before questions are asked." The inspector frowned, considering this, and then closed his notebook with a sigh. "I'll have a word with her in the morning. She lives in the cottages off the lane, doesn't she?" "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "The little one with geraniums in the window. Her aunt keeps it, but if you mean to speak to her, I'd not delay too long. A frightened girl." can vanish before dawn, especially if someone else wishes her gone. Graves studied her for a moment, unsure whether to take her warning as prophecy or interference. But Miss Marple merely smiled faintly, as if to remind him that human nature, once set in motion, rarely paused for police procedure. When she left the Carruthers' house that evening, the rain had stopped, and the air was sharp with the smell of wet earth. The village green lay silent, its lamps dimmed, and somewhere in the distance a clock struck 11. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping the cobbles in thought. She passed the vicarage, then the post office, until she came upon the narrow lane leading toward Lily's cottage. A faint light still burned behind the curtains. She hesitated only briefly before knocking. There was a shuffling sound, then the door opened a crack. Lily stood there, eyes red and swollen, a shawl clutched around her shoulders. When she saw Miss Marple, her mouth quivered. "Oh, ma'am," she whispered, "I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't." "Didn't mean to what, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lily shook her head, glancing over her shoulder as though someone might be listening. "I did what she told me. Mrs. Carruthers said to put the sugar out fresh this morning. I never touched nothing else." Miss Marple's voice was calm, patient. "You poured it from the tin yourself?" "Yes, ma'am, only—" She hesitated. "The tin wasn't where it should have been. Someone had moved it. I thought maybe the cook. But she's off sick, and when I asked Mrs. Carruthers, she just snapped that I was to do as I was told. I didn't want more trouble." The girl's words tumbled out in broken gasps. Miss Marple waited until she quieted, then said softly, "You've done nothing wrong, my dear. But tell me, did anyone else go near the pantry today?" Lily's brow furrowed. "The Colonel came by. He said he was looking for Mrs. Carruthers' gardener, but he went round the back, near the kitchen door. I didn't think nothing of it." Miss Marple's eyes flickered, the faintest spark of thought behind them. "No, of course not. And did Mrs. Wilmot come early?" "A bit. She said she wanted to help set the table, but she didn't do much, just moved things about." The rain began again, light and steady, ticking against the window pane. Miss Marple looked around the tiny room, the worn hearth, the empty teacup, the girl trembling in her chair, and felt the pattern beginning to take shape. "You must rest now," she said kindly, rising. "The inspector will come in the morning, but you've nothing to fear if you speak the truth. And, Lily," she paused at the door, "keep your shutters closed tonight. Sometimes it's not ghosts that walk after dark, but memories." Lily nodded, confused but comforted, as Miss Marple stepped back into the drizzle. She walked slowly toward the green, her mind knitting together the small, uneven threads. A quarrel overheard last week, a maid's trembling hands, and a sugar bowl that had waited all morning for the right moment to be stirred. By the time she reached her cottage, the clock had struck midnight. Miss Marple set her umbrella in its stand, lit her lamp, and smiled faintly to herself. "Poison," she murmured, "is never chosen by chance." And with that, she settled into her armchair, the storm whispering beyond the windows, and began to think of who, among the polite and smiling faces at tea, had needed Mrs. Carruthers gone, not for anger, but for survival. Morning came grey and low over St. Mildred's, the kind of morning where even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. The news of Mrs. Carruthers's death had spread across the village like mist, curling through hedgerows and around post-boxes. By 8 o'clock, everyone knew, or thought they knew, what had happened. Some said it was the maid, others whispered about the Colonel's debts, and a few insisted it was simply heart failure brought on by gluttony. Gossip, Miss Marple thought as she stirred her tea, was a poor substitute for truth, but it often left useful crumbs along the way. Inspector Graves appeared at her garden gate not long after breakfast, his hat pulled low and his face set in that grim look policemen wear when they expect to find nothing but trouble. Miss Marple, who had been pruning her roses, greeted him with mild surprise and invited him in for tea. "I've just come from the cottage," he began, removing his gloves with deliberate care. "The girl's frightened out of her wits, but she says you came by last night." "I did," said Miss Marple calmly. Poor child, she needed a kind ear more than a constable. Graves grunted. "She mentioned something about the sugar tin being moved and about the colonel snooping round the back door. Does that strike you as likely?" "Oh, very likely," Miss Marple said, pouring his tea. "Colonel Farnsworth has always had a curious habit of being in places he shouldn't, and Mrs. Wilmot arriving early to help set the table, well, that's rather unlike her, don't you think?" Graves blinked. "You know her well." "I know human nature, Inspector," she replied gently. "And Mrs. Wilmot is a woman who enjoys being seen helping, not actually helping. The sort who rearranges flowers after the vicar's wife has gone to such pains to place them correctly. She would only arrive early if she had a reason." Graves scribbled a note, his pencil pressing hard against the paper. "You think she might have tampered with the sugar herself?" "I think she may have watched someone else do it," Miss Marple said softly, "which in certain ways is much the same thing." They sat for a moment in silence, the faint ticking of the clock filling the pause. Then Miss Marple said, "It might interest you to know that Mrs. Carruthers had been keeping letters, quite a number of them. I overheard her mentioning it to the postmistress last week. She claimed to have proof of impropriety concerning certain villagers. She was not above using such knowledge when it suited her." Graves looked up sharply. "Blackmail?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. A rather ugly word for what she preferred to call moral correction. She thought of herself as the guardian of St. Mildred's virtue. The inspector swore under his breath. So anyone she'd threatened might have had reason to silence her. "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "And as it happens, I believe the good colonel's gambling debts were recently the subject of one of her little lectures." Graves rose abruptly. "Then he's our man." Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes kind but firm. "Oh, I shouldn't be too hasty. The colonel is bluster and noise, just the sort of man a clever woman might let take the blame. Remember, Inspector, poison is a coward's weapon, not a soldier's." He looked unconvinced but took his leave, muttering that he'd have another word with Farnsworth all the same. When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple remained still for a long while, gazing at the steam rising from her teacup. Then she stood, went to her writing desk, and took out a small notebook she kept for village observations. Little things that often turned out to be not so little, after all. She flipped to a clean page and wrote in her neat, slanted hand, "Lily. Afraid but honest. Sugar tin moved. Colonel near kitchen. Mrs. Wilmot early. Motive uncertain. Bitter almonds, arsenic or cyanide likely deliberate. Who benefits from silence?" Her pen hovered for a moment before she added another note beneath it. "The curate. Nervous. Avoided eye contact. Mentioned Mrs. Carruthers's donations last month. Did she refuse him something? Or threaten to reveal something?" Outside, the church bell began to toll for morning prayers. Miss Marple closed the notebook, slipped it into her knitting basket, and tied her hat beneath her chin. There was something about young Mr. Bellamy's pale face yesterday, she recalled. Guilt, perhaps, or terror mistaken for grief. Either way, it was worth a gentle word or two after the service. As she stepped into the cool morning air, she paused, looking toward the Carruthers' house across the green. Its windows were shuttered now, the blinds drawn tight, but Miss Marple knew that in St. Mildred's no curtain was thick enough to hide a secret for long. She smiled faintly to herself, the sort of smile one might wear while watching a puzzle slowly fall into place. The truth, she thought, always begins with a small sound. A whispered lie, a trembling hand, a teacup set down just a moment too late, and before the day was through she intended to find who had dropped it. The church bells were still echoing when Miss Marple took her usual place in the back pew, the faint scent of candle wax mingling with the chill of stone. The morning congregation was smaller than usual, though the air was thick with speculation rather than prayer. Mrs. Wilmot sat 2 rows ahead, her hat too large for the sombre occasion, whispering behind a hymn book to Mrs. Penbury, who nodded gravely at each hushed remark. Colonel Farnsworth knelt stiffly in the front, his broad shoulders rigid, while young Mr. Bellamy, the curate, fumbled through the service with a voice that trembled more than the candles. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. He seemed distracted, reading the wrong lines, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the pages. When the final hymn ended, he nearly dropped the Bible. Mrs. Wilmot was the first to approach him, her voice sugar-sweet but edged with curiosity. "A dreadful thing, isn't it, Mr. Bellamy? Poor Mrs. Carruthers. Such a pillar of morality, too. Why, one can hardly imagine anyone wanting her gone." Mr. Bellamy managed a thin smile. "Yes, quite tragic." His gaze flicked toward Miss Marple as he spoke, then away again almost immediately. Guilt or fear? Miss Marple could not yet tell. Outside the church, the villagers gathered in little knots, pretending to talk of the weather, but speaking, of course, only of death. Colonel Farnsworth stood alone by the gate, lighting his pipe with unsteady hands. Miss Marple approached him with a kindly nod. "Colonel," she said softly, "I imagine this business has been quite a shock." He exhaled a puff of smoke that hung in the damp air. "Shock, indeed. Damn unpleasant thing, poison. If you ask me, the girl did it. That maid of hers, always lurking about, always nervous. You could tell she was trouble." Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant. "Nerves often come from living among tempers, Colonel, not from guilt. You were at Mrs. Carruthers's side most of the afternoon, weren't you?" He frowned. I hardly said a word to her. She had her circle of hens to cluck with. But you did go round to the back garden, I believe. Looking for the gardener." His jaw tightened. "Yes. Old Ben was supposed to fetch a crate for me. Thought I'd find him near the shed." "And did you?" "No," he said shortly, glancing toward the churchyard wall as though eager to end the conversation. "Look here, Miss Marple, I know what people are saying. I had my quarrels with Emily Carruthers. Who hasn't? But I wouldn't stoop to poison." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Of course not. Men who fight their battles openly rarely need to stoop at all." Her words were mild, but they left him uneasy. She let him go and turned her steps toward the vicarage, where Mr. Bellamy was lingering at the gate, pretending to admire the roses. He started when she greeted him. "You know, Mr. Bellamy," she said gently, "I once knew a young curate very much like yourself. Earnest, well-meaning, but easily tangled in other people's affairs. It can be quite dangerous in a village like ours." He blinked. "Dangerous?" "Indeed," she said, lowering her voice just enough. "When secrets begin to stir, those with the gentlest consciences often suffer the most. You were very pale yesterday, I thought. Mrs. Carruthers could be a formidable woman. Did she ever make you feel compromised?" The young man's throat bobbed. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple replied softly. "She was fond of her moral crusades. I imagine she might have disapproved of certain friendships." He looked away, color rising to his cheeks. "She said things, terrible things. She threatened to tell the vicar. But it wasn't true, I swear it." Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "She had a way of twisting half-truths into weapons, didn't she? But tell me, did she ever put her threats into writing?" He hesitated. "Yes. Letters. I burned them." Miss Marple watched him closely. "All of them?" A pause. "I think so." She smiled gently, but her mind was already racing. "Well, my dear, if I may give you advice, keep your conscience clear, but your door locked. The truth has a way of knocking when one least expects it." She left him standing there, pale and uncertain, and walked slowly toward home. The pieces were beginning to shift, not yet forming a picture, but close enough to suggest its outline. A woman who thrived on secrets, a colonel with pride, a curate with shame, and a maid too frightened to speak. Each had touched that sugar bowl, in action or in thought. As she crossed the green, Miss Marple noticed a small figure moving hurriedly along the far path. Mrs. Wilmot, her umbrella tucked under her arm, heading not toward home, but toward the Carruthers' house. Miss Marple stopped, frowning slightly. The police had sealed it only yesterday. She watched until Mrs. Wilmot disappeared through the gate, her gloved hand fumbling at the latch. Then, with a quiet sigh and the faintest smile, Miss Marple turned in the same direction. Some women, she reflected, simply could not resist tidying up after themselves. The wind had picked up by the time Miss Marple reached the Carruthers' gate, carrying the faint rustle of rain against the hedges. She paused in the shadow of the lilac bush, her keen eyes observing the slight movement of a curtain within. Mrs. Wilmot was inside. There could be no doubt of that. The front door, though closed, was not properly latched. It gave a faint creak as Miss Marple pressed it gently open. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish and something else, something sharp and chemical beneath it. She stepped lightly into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Somewhere deeper in the house came the faint clink of porcelain. Mrs. Wilmot was in the drawing-room, busying herself with the tea set that had not yet been cleared since the day of the tragedy. "My dear Mrs. Wilmot," Miss Marple said pleasantly as she entered, "I do hope you haven't taken it upon yourself to play housemaid. The inspector might take it rather amiss if he knew the evidence was being so thoroughly tidied." Mrs. Wilmot gasped, spinning round. Her face flushed pink beneath her hat. "Miss Marple, you quite startled me. Well, really, I couldn't bear the thought of poor Emily's lovely china sitting here, covered in dust. I only meant to put things right." Miss Marple smiled with gentle sympathy. "Of course, one hates disorder after death. It makes it all seem so final." She let her gaze drift toward the tea tray, though I dare say Inspector Graves might wish to see these cups as they were. Memory can be such a fragile thing when tea is involved. Mrs. Wilmot's hands fluttered nervously at her sides. "Oh, surely that's all been examined already. The police took what they needed, I'm certain." "I'm not so sure," Miss Marple replied quietly. "In my experience, the police are thorough about fingerprints and motives, but not always about human habits. For instance, how one stirs one's tea, or who prefers sugar first and tea second. I happen to remember you, Mrs. Wilmot, always took 2 lumps and stirred rather briskly, clockwise. Yet your cup on that dreadful afternoon had no sugar at all." Mrs. Wilmot froze, colour draining from her cheeks. "You can't possibly remember that." "Oh, but I can," Miss Marple said gently. "One notices such things when one's mind is idle, and you see it was quite odd, because when Mrs. Carruthers poured from the same pot, she reached for the sugar herself. Not her usual habit, I think. She always had Lily do it." A tremor passed through Mrs. Wilmot's hands, and the spoon she held clattered onto the tray. I don't know what you're implying." "I imply nothing," said Miss Marple softly. "Only that perhaps you were aware the sugar wasn't safe, and perhaps in your nervousness you thought it best to take your tea plain. A prudent choice, under the circumstances." Mrs. Wilmot turned sharply away, pressing a hand to her mouth. For a long moment there was only the sound of the rain outside pattering steadily against the windows. "You must understand," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "It wasn't meant to kill her, only to make her ill, to frighten her a little. She was ruining everything. My husband, she threatened to expose him, said she'd tell the vicar about his fondness for drink. I couldn't bear it any longer." Miss Marple said nothing, only watched the woman tremble before her. "You used something from your husband's workshop, perhaps," she said after a moment. "A gardener's poison, the kind kept for moles or weeds. Easy enough to mistake for sugar when one's desperate." Mrs. Wilmot nodded weakly, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean it. I only wanted her frightened. I thought just a little would do. But she, took 2 spoons, greedy woman that she was. When she fell, oh, I thought I'd die myself. Guilt can be a heavy companion, Miss Marple murmured, though you'll find it grows lighter when it's shared with the proper authorities. Mrs. Wilmot sank into a chair, sobbing quietly. Miss Marple, ever practical, went to the window and opened it slightly to let in the cool, damp air. "You must tell Inspector Graves everything," she said kindly but firmly. "The truth now will save others from harm later. Secrets have a dreadful way of seeping through walls." As she turned to leave, she glanced once more at the tea tray. One of the cups was still faintly rimmed with sugar, glinting in the pale morning light. Poor Emily Carruthers, she murmured to herself, a woman who could never stop stirring trouble until someone stirred it back. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. Miss Marple closed the gate behind her, her umbrella lifting lightly in the breeze. She felt no triumph, only a quiet melancholy that seemed to settle over the whole village. Justice, she knew, often came in whispers rather than fanfare. And as she walked home through the wet grass, she thought how in St. Mildred's even the gentlest of teas could hide the darkest of intentions. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage not long after luncheon, his expression dark and weary. The drizzle had not let up, and his coat was damp around the shoulders. Miss Marple, who had been quietly darning a sock by the window, greeted him with a sympathetic smile and poured him a cup of tea before he had the chance to speak. "She's confessed," he said at last, rubbing his hands over the fire. "Mrs. Wilmot, I mean. She broke down completely, said she only wanted to make Mrs. Carruthers ill, claimed it was an accident that turned fatal, but the magistrate won't see it that way, not with poison involved." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes following the dancing flames. "No, I don't suppose he will. And yet," she said after a pause, "something still troubles me, Inspector." Mrs. Wilmot was frightened, yes, and desperate. But not clever enough to know just how little poison it takes or how swiftly it acts. She might have meant mischief, but she wouldn't have understood chemistry. Graves frowned. She said she found the bottle in her husband's shed. Rat poison. Arsenic. Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea. But the symptoms, those poor lips of Mrs. Carruthers, the speed with which she collapsed, it was not arsenic, Inspector. Arsenic lingers. This was something much quicker. Cyanide, perhaps. And that is not something one finds among weed killers or household supplies. Graves straightened, alarmed. "Then you think—" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that Mrs. Wilmot's guilt was convenient rather than complete. She believed she caused the death because someone wanted her to. Believe it. A frightened conscience is so very easy to guide." The inspector stared at her, the color rising in his cheeks. "Then who—" "Let us consider," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "who had both opportunity and understanding. Someone who could move freely in the Carruthers house, who might have access to chemicals, and who had every reason to wish Mrs. Carruthers silenced, permanently, not merely frightened." Graves leaned forward. "The curate." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she looked up. "Mr. Bellamy, a young man of learning, no doubt accustomed to assisting the vicar with parish records and perhaps even the church gardens. Did you know, Inspector, that the church keeps cyanide tablets to put down vermin in the cellar? The vicar mentioned it once in passing in connection with the preservation of hymn books from mice." Graves cursed softly. "Good Lord." "And," Miss Marple continued, "Mr. Bellamy admitted to me that Mrs. Carruthers had written him certain letters, blackmailing him, I believe, about an imagined impropriety. He said he burned them, but I rather suspect he burned only the harmless ones." Graves stood abruptly. "I'll fetch him now." Miss Marple rose slowly, shaking her head. No, Inspector. You mustn't frighten him yet. He'll retreat into his pulpit and quote repentance. Men like him convince themselves they're forgiven before they've even been caught. Better to let him believe he's safe a little longer." The inspector hesitated, torn between duty and deference to her uncanny sense. "Then what do you suggest?" "A quiet evening service, perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. "He'll be there, of course. The guilty rarely miss prayers. They think it earns them time, and when he kneels at the altar, you'll find his hands trembling. It is always the hands that give them away." That evening, as the sun sank behind the church spire, St. Mildred's filled with flickering candlelight and the low murmur of hymns. Miss Marple sat once again in the back pew, her posture serene, her eyes steady on the young curate. His face was pale, his smile forced, and his words, "Deliver us from evil," caught faintly in his throat. When the service ended, Inspector Graves appeared at the side door, his steps soft on the stone. Miss Marple did not look round, but she saw the faint movement, a hand reaching into a pocket, a sudden hesitation, a whisper of metal. She rose quietly, her voice clear but gentle. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, and every head turned toward her. "Do take care. That bottle in your coat will do you no favors." The curate froze, eyes wide, the small glass vial trembling in his grip. For a long, terrible second, the church was silent except for the drip of rain through the roof. Then the vial slipped from his hand and shattered against the flagstone, the sharp scent of almonds filling the air. Miss Marple sighed softly. "There now," she murmured. Confession in its truest form. As Graves led the shaken man away, Miss Marple remained in the pew, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. The villagers watched her with a mixture of awe and discomfort. She smiled faintly, though her eyes were distant. "It's a dreadful thing," she said at last, "how easily the righteous convince themselves their sins are sanctified. Mrs. Carruthers used her morality as a weapon, and Mr. Bellamy, poor soul, only turned it back upon her. Poison, you see, has a way of finding its proper owner." And with that, she gathered her shawl and stepped out into the cool night, where the rain had finally stopped, and the air smelled, faintly and mercifully, of roses once more. The following morning dawned unusually still, the kind of quiet that feels earned after long rain. The village green glistened with dew, and a pale mist hovered over the hedgerows, like a lingering thought no one quite dared to voice. By 7:30, St. Mildred's had resumed its rhythm. Milk deliveries clinking down the lane, a dog barking somewhere near the post office. But an unease remained, a silence behind the chatter. The curate's arrest had been the talk of every kitchen table. Miss Marple, however, sat by her window with her tea cooling beside her, eyes lost in the pages of the Times but mind elsewhere. The newspaper spoke of politics and distant storms, yet her thoughts returned to the church, to the faint shiver that had passed over Mr. Bellamy's face before the vial slipped from his hand. It had been guilt, yes, but guilt rarely traveled alone. It often brought fear as its companion. A soft knock at the door drew her from thought. When she opened it, Inspector Graves stood on the step, hat in hand. He looked tired, older somehow. "He's confessed," he said without ceremony. "Said Mrs. Carruthers threatened to ruin him. He put cyanide in the sugar that morning, meant it for her alone. Claims he swapped the tin himself when no one was about." Miss Marple motioned him inside, her expression gentle but not surprised. "Poor young man," she murmured. "His mind must have been a battlefield, fear on one side, righteousness on the other. And yet I dare say his confession doesn't quite explain everything." Graves frowned. "What doesn't it explain?" "The timing," she said, stirring her tea. "He claims to have changed the sugar that morning, but the Carruthers maid, Lily, said she poured it herself. Found the tin moved, yes, but still half full. She would have noticed if it were new or tampered with. It's curious, isn't it? Either the curate was mistaken, or someone else ensured the exchange after Lily set the table." Graves' brow furrowed. "You're suggesting he wasn't acting alone?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "In murder, Inspector, one rarely is. Even when the deed is solitary, there is often someone who helps it along. out of fear or pity, or the kind of affection that hides itself under pious words. She rose and crossed to the window, where the mist was beginning to thin. "Have you spoken to the vicar?" Graves looked puzzled. "The vicar? Why should he be involved?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "he was Mrs. Carruthers's moral ally. He allowed her to stir up half the parish under the name of virtue. And because Mr. Bellamy's sermons, these past few weeks, have been unusually restrained, almost as though someone had clipped his wings." The inspector said nothing for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, he muttered, "He was the one who found the letters. Brought them to me after Bellamy's arrest. Claimed he'd discovered them in the curate's desk." Miss Marple turned from the window. Letters Mrs. Carruthers had written to him, perhaps condemning the curate, perhaps hinting at something more. Curious, don't you think, that a man of faith should search another's desk after justice was done, not before? Graves' mouth tightened. "You think the vicar helped him?" "Oh, no," she said mildly. "Not helped, guided. It's quite different. He may have convinced the poor boy that silence was his duty, that to remove temptation from the world was an act of righteousness. It happens more often than one imagines, Inspector, when authority mistakes its own reflection for divine light." Graves stared at her, speechless. "You think he planted those letters?" Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "To ensure the story ended neatly. But truth is never so tidy. I should pay the vicar a visit, I think. I've always found clergymen to be at their most honest when faced with a pot of tea and an unexpected question." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. The path was slick with the remnants of rain, and the church bell tolled softly as if sighing over the week's events. The vicar, a thin, austere man with silver hair and a nervous smile, welcomed her politely, though his eyes flickered with something wary. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, leading her to the sitting room. "A tragic business. I'm afraid poor Mr. Bellamy lost his way entirely. So young, so impressionable." Miss Marple settled into her chair. "Indeed, it's dreadful when guidance goes astray, though I imagine he had much of it from you." The vicar paused mid-pour, the teapot trembling slightly in his hand. "I beg your pardon." "Oh, don't misunderstand me," she said kindly. "You only did what you thought right, encouraging him to confess, to cleanse his soul. It must be difficult, knowing that one's advice may have hastened his downfall." He set the teapot down, his knuckles whitening around the handle. "I merely advised repentance." "Of course," Miss Marple said softly. "But you also told him that Mrs. Carruthers's hold over him was ungodly, that to resist her was to serve truth. He admired you, you know. Looked to you as a father. It must have been easy to believe your words justified his act." The vicar's face had grown ashen. For a moment he looked very small, like a man caught between pride and despair. "You can't prove that," he whispered. Miss Marple smiled faintly, folding her hands. "I shan't try. Some proofs are best left in the conscience, not the courtroom, but I expect you'll visit him before the trial. He'll need forgiveness, from you most of all." When she left the vicarage, the mist had lifted entirely, revealing the church spire against a pale blue sky. She paused by the gate, breathing in the scent of rain-washed grass. The village seemed at peace again, but Miss Marple knew peace was a fragile thing, too easily broken by those who believed themselves righteous. As she turned toward home, she thought of Mrs. Carruthers, of Lily, of Mrs. Wilmot, and of the frightened young curate who had listened too well. Evil, she reflected, seldom announced itself with wicked laughter. More often, it spoke in gentle voices, quoting scripture or offering sugar to sweeten the tea. The sun dipped low that evening, painting the cottages of St. Mildred's in gold and quiet. Smoke drifted from chimneys, the faint scent of wood fire mingling with damp leaves. The village, it seemed, had already begun to forget. People prefer their tragedies brief. They fold them away between supper and sleep, content that someone else has been found guilty. But Miss Marple knew that forgetting was simply the village's way of sealing the cracks, not mending them. She walked home slowly from the vicarage, her umbrella tapping a steady rhythm along the path. The vicar's trembling hands had told her more than any confession ever could. Guilt had settled on him like frost, not for the murder itself, perhaps, but for the quiet words that had allowed it to happen. The curate's crime had been an act of fear, the vicar's of pride, and both, Miss Marple thought sadly, were born of the same root, the human conviction that one knows better than mercy itself. When she reached her cottage, she found Inspector Graves waiting by her gate, his coat buttoned to the chin and his expression softer than usual. "We've closed the case," he said, almost apologetically. "The young curate will stand trial. The magistrate's satisfied. There's talk he'll plead for leniency." Miss Marple nodded, unlocking her door. "I imagine he will. He's a good man at heart, merely guided by the wrong shepherd." Graves followed her in, reluctant to let the matter rest. "You don't think the vicar was part of it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, setting the kettle on the stove, "that the vicar will live the rest of his days with the knowledge that he helped create a sinner where he meant to save one. That is punishment enough." She turned toward him, her face lit gently by the firelight. "But human justice, Inspector, is rarely as precise as divine retribution. It tends to stop where paperwork ends." The inspector gave a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You make it sound as though the case isn't truly finished." "Oh, it's finished," she said softly. "Just not over." They drank their tea in thoughtful silence, the clock ticking steadily above the mantel. When Graves finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "You know," he said slowly, "I sometimes wonder if you aren't wasted on roses and knitting. You'd make a fine detective." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I am one. Only mine is the quiet kind. You see, murder may belong to the police, but motive belongs to the soul, and one must tend to both, or the weeds grow back." After he had gone, the cottage settled into peace again. Outside, the wind whispered through the hedges, carrying with it the faint toll of the church bell. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting in her lap, though she had not yet begun to stitch. The firelight danced across her spectacles as she gazed into the flames. She thought of Lily, who would soon find work again in some gentler household, of Mrs. Wilmot, whose remorse would turn into a kind of fragile charity, and of Mr. Bellamy, sitting alone in his cell, perhaps already reciting prayers he no longer believed that would reach heaven. Each had played a part, each had believed themselves cornered by circumstance, and each, in some small way, had chosen to act. Miss Marple sighed, leaning back in her chair. "People do dreadful things," she murmured, "when they mistake righteousness for goodness." The clock chimed 9, and she rose to draw the curtains. Across the green, the church stood dark against the night, its windows black and unseeing. Yet in that darkness, she thought, the truth remained. Quiet, enduring, patient as ever. Tomorrow the village would speak of other things, the flower show, the new baker, the weather. But beneath the gossip and the laughter, the echo of a teacup breaking and a woman's last breath would linger, faint but unforgettable. And as Miss Marple extinguished the lamp, she allowed herself one final thought before the quiet claimed the room. That evil, however politely dressed, always leaves behind a trace, a scent, a word, a memory, waiting for someone with patience enough to notice. A few days later, the village of St. Mildred's began to settle once more into its polite, watchful routine. The curtains that had fluttered in curiosity during the scandal now hung still again, and the Morning Post resumed its quiet deliveries of letters that spoke of nothing more deadly than seed catalogues or the Women's Guild raffle. Yet beneath the polished veneer of normality, there lingered a faint restlessness, the kind that comes after too many whispered confessions. Miss Marple felt it as she walked to the grocer's that morning, her basket on her arm, nodding politely to those who greeted her with cautious smiles. People had stopped mentioning Mrs. Carruthers's name directly, but their eyes shifted when the conversation turned to tea, sugar, or sermons. A village has a long memory, she knew, even when its tongue grows silent. Outside the churchyard gate, she paused. The curate's name, Mr. Bellamy, had already been removed from the parish notice board. The vicar, it seemed, wished to erase all trace of scandal, as though faith could be laundered clean with a new sheet of paper. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, then turned toward the path that led past the cottages. As she passed Lily's small home, the girl herself stepped out, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. Her face still held traces of fear, but there was a new steadiness in her eyes. When she saw Miss Marple, she stopped, twisting the edge of her shawl nervously. "Good morning, Lily," Miss Marple said kindly. "You're looking a little better today." "Yes, ma'am. Aunt says it's best to keep busy." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "They said in the paper that the curate did it, that he's in prison now." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, my dear. It's very sad. But you mustn't let it weigh on you. The truth has a way of finding its place." Lily looked down, her brow creasing. "Only, I keep thinking, ma'am, about that morning. I told the inspector everything, but something keeps coming back to me." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Oh? And what is that?" "It's silly, perhaps. Just before the tea, Mrs. Carruthers sent me to fetch the good china. When I came back, she was speaking to someone through the kitchen window. I didn't see who, just heard her voice, sharp-like. She said, 'It's no use denying it. I know about the account.' Then she saw me and stopped." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the handle of her basket. "The account," she repeated. "Did she ever mention that word again?" Lily shook her head. "No, ma'am. Only that afternoon when she went to pour the tea, she seemed calmer, smiling even. I thought she'd made peace with whoever it was." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her mind was already turning. "You've been very helpful, Lily. Never doubt that small details can make all the difference. Sometimes, you see, a smile tells us when a quarrel has truly ended, and when it hasn't." After Lily had gone, Miss Marple continued down the lane, her steps slower now, her thoughts weaving a delicate pattern. An account, she thought. Mrs. Carruthers was not a woman who used such a word lightly. It suggested business, money perhaps, or something held over another. And if she had threatened to expose someone's secret, that person might well have found relief in her death. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the postmistress, Mrs. Ellis, who knew more about the private affairs of St. Mildred's than, anyone admitted. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice. "I wonder, have you ever noticed if Mrs. Carruthers had dealings with anyone beyond our little village? Perhaps correspondence of a financial nature?" Mrs. Ellis pursed her lips. "Well, now you mention it, there were letters from the bank in Holmleigh. Not unusual in itself, mind, but they came rather often these last few months. Registered ones, too. I remember because she always signed for them in a hurry and never said a word." Miss Marple thanked her and walked home through the lengthening shadows, the wind carrying the faint toll of the evening bell. Something was stirring beneath the surface of the neat conclusion Inspector Graves had drawn. If Mrs. Carruthers had been dealing with a private account, something secret, something worth threatening over, then her death might have been convenient not only to the curate, but to someone else entirely. That evening, as the fire crackled softly in her hearth, Miss Marple took out her notebook once more. She wrote in her careful, looping hand, "Account, Holmleigh Bank. Who benefits from silence? Possible forgery or misappropriation." The curate lacked access, but who did not? Her pen paused. Then she added another line. The vicar manages parish donations. Miss Marple closed the notebook with a quiet snap. The case, it seemed, had not been as neatly tied as the inspector had hoped. For in St. Mildred's, secrets were like ivy. Even when one branch was cut, another quietly grew beneath the wall. Outside, the night deepened. The church stood dark again, but somewhere within, a single light flickered behind the vicarage window, the kind of light one leaves burning when sleep refuses to come. Miss Marple watched it a moment, then drew her curtains. She had seen such lights before. They belonged to people who knew too much, or had done too much, to ever rest easily again. The following morning brought a peculiar brightness to St. Mildred's, that brittle sort of sunshine which comes after long rain, making even the cobblestones look freshly scrubbed. The village, for all its gossip and grief, seemed to breathe again. And yet, behind its cheerful facade, something remained unresolved. Something that tugged gently, insistently, at Miss Marple's ever-curious mind. She had sent a letter to Holmley Bank the previous evening, a polite inquiry disguised as a matter of local charity. The reply arrived promptly by hand that morning, delivered by a red-cheeked post-boy who looked rather proud of the envelope's importance. Miss Marple opened it at her breakfast table, her toast growing cold beside her. The letter was brief, but revealing. There had indeed been an account in Mrs. Carruthers's name, one which had received regular deposits from the parish's benevolence fund. And most curiously, the withdrawals had been authorized not by Mrs. Carruthers, but by the vicar himself. She sat for some time in thought, her knitting untouched, the ticking of the clock loud in the stillness. It all fell quietly, inexorably, into place. The vicar's sudden defensiveness, the carefully misplaced letters, the pious urgency with which he had urged repentance from others while covering his own transgressions. He had used Mrs. Carruthers's moral zeal as a shield. When she discovered his misuse of parish funds and threatened exposure, he had subtly steered the frightened curate into doing the unthinkable, dressing sin as duty. By noon, Miss Marple made her way to the church once more. The vicar was in his study, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment his expression flickered between relief and dread. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, forcing a thin smile, "I hardly expected a visit so soon." "I dare say not," she replied gently, removing her gloves. "I've come about Mrs. Carruthers. I believe she had recently threatened to reveal something, a small matter concerning the parish fund." The vicar's face tightened. "I see you've been busy." "Not busy," she said softly. "Merely observant. The bank was most obliging. You'd signed her name, of course. A dangerous habit, though one imagines it began quite innocently. A borrowed £1 here, a charitable loan there, until it grew too heavy to conceal. When she found out, she meant to tell the diocesan board. You convinced poor Mr. Bellamy that silencing her was righteousness itself. He was weak enough to believe you." His hands trembled as they clutched the edge of the desk. "You've no proof," he whispered. "No legal proof, perhaps," she admitted. "But spiritual crimes seldom hide behind law for long. I've told Inspector Graves that a further inquiry might be necessary. I imagine he'll find the bank records rather persuasive." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the vicar sank into his chair, the weight of his composure breaking at last. "I wanted only to preserve the parish," he murmured, his voice cracking. "She would have destroyed everything. I thought, if she were gone, it would stop." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "Evil rarely stops when one feeds it, Reverend. It simply learns to kneel." When she left the vicarage, the afternoon air was still and faintly sweet with the scent of hyacinths. Across the green, children played once more, their laughter carrying lightly through the quiet lanes. The village would recover, as villages always do. though its peace would be of that delicate kind that knows too well how easily it can be disturbed. At home, Miss Marple sat by her fire and took up her knitting again, the wool looping calmly between her fingers. There was comfort, she thought, in small, steady tasks, in the order one could create with patience and attention. The world outside might twist itself into dreadful knots, but human nature was, in its essence, predictable. Greed cloaked as virtue, fear dressed as duty, love corrupted by secrecy. She smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly. "It's never the tea that kills," she murmured to herself. "Only the lies that come before it." And as dusk fell gently over St. Mildred's, the church bell tolled once, a single hollow note, and Miss Marple, serene as ever, listened to its echo fade into the evening, satisfied that the village and its sins were at last laid to rest.